in political philosophy is deception. Second, Strauss believed that society should be hierarchical, divided between an elite who should lead and the masses who should follow. Strauss believed that those who are fit to rule are those who realize there is no morality and that there is only one natural right, the right of the superior to rule over the inferior. Elitism. The people are told what they need to know and no more, while the elite few are capable of absorbing the absence of any moral truth. Strauss thought the masses could not cope. If exposed to the absence of absolute truth, they would quickly fall into nihilism or anarchy, hence authoritarianism. Strauss had a huge contempt for secular democracy. A major mistake, he thought, too, was made by insisting on a separation of church and state. And why? Because Strauss viewed religion as absolutely essential in order to impose moral law on the masses who otherwise would be out of control. Paternalism. Religion was for the masses alone, he stressed. The rulers need not be bound by it. Indeed, it would be absurd if they were, since the truths proclaimed by religion are a pious fraud, hypocrisy. Secular society, in their view, is the worst possible thing, speaking of the Straussians, because it leads to individualism, liberalism, and relativism, precisely those traits that may promote dissent that could in turn dangerously weaken society's ability to cope with external threats. Hence, anti-secularism, another point on which Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson would agree with Leo Strauss. Human beings can only be restrained by a powerful nationalistic state. Because mankind is intrinsically wicked, he has to be governed, he once wrote. Such governance can only be established, however, when men are united, and they can only be united against other people. Hence a powerful anti-democratic strand. Strauss thinks that a political order can be stable only if it is united by an external threat. Following Machiavelli, he maintained that if no external threat exists, then one has to be manufactured. Liars, cheaters, thieves, shades of the Northwoods operation. Finally, the Straussians have no use for liberalism and democracy, even though they're conquering the world in the name of liberalism and democracy. And isn't that the truth? We go to Iraq and the claim that we're going to expand democracy and freedom abroad while we are at the same time contracting freedom and liberty at home. Now, I would expand on this to illustrate how Chomsky doesn't get it in relation to the famous piece, Fascism Anyone, where Lawrence Britt enumerates the 14 characteristics of fascism, and anyone who measures where the United States stands today against his 14 criteria can well appreciate that we satisfy at least a dozen of those 14. But even more interesting for our occasion here is a piece by Alan Utman talking about 10 top signs, the top 10 signs of an impending U.S. police state, which in my judgment reflects where we appear to be heading. Listen to these 10. Free speech zones. I'll never forget when Vice President Cheney came to Duluth and he was going to speak, and they had a designated area where they put all the protesters, someplace where he could not even see them from the highway as he came into town. Free speech zones? The whole United States is supposed to be a free speech zone. Touch-screen voting machines like the No Child Left Behind Act, which I'm convinced is a covert plan for resegregating American schools. The Help America Vote Act requires communities to purchase electronic voting machines, which just happen to be under control of a small number of corporations with direct ties to the GOP. We have had elections stolen from us using these machines in 2000 and 2002 and 2004. 2000 in Florida, 2002 in Georgia, 2004 in Ohio, most massively. They have changed the course of history by using these electronic theft machines, and yet the manufacturers claim they can't produce a responsible, reliable voting machine when they can produce the most efficient, detailed, and exact ATMs in the world. The same company that claims it can't produce voting machines, produce your ATM. Go up, take a look, the name on the machine, Diebold. And I tell you, the software for these machines could not be simpler. Take a number n and add 1 to it to produce a new number n prime. Anyone who represents that these voting machines are complicated and the software is proprietary is lying to you to your face. The only thing that could possibly be proprietary here would be if in fact they have a sophisticated aspect for reallocating the vote. There should be these electronic voting machines must be abolished. Number 3, the long war. The great benefit of the substitution of, terrorism. They needed a successor for communism. Communism was great for the military-industrial complex because it gave a motivation, it gave a demand that needed their supply. With the demise of the Cold War, they have been scrambling to find a substitute. Nothing could possibly work better than terrorism. Terrorism is so vague, so nebulous, we could be committing a terrorist act by speaking here together about these matters, mark my words. And you can perpetrate any act like a Bali bombing if you want, or something going on in New York City, or something else in Palestine, and you can blame it on the terrorists, and who in the world is going to know better? Even though it may be American intelligence operatives who are actually pulling the strings and bringing these events about. The USA Patriot Act, I've already alluded to it. We've got it, the Fourth, and the Sixth Amendment. The Constitution is a shambles. Signing statements. This President of the United States has imposed his interpretation of the law on 750 laws. Now, I just want you to stop and ponder what this means. We have a traditional division between the legislature, which passes the laws, the executive, which enforces them, and the judiciary, which interprets them. He has preempted unto himself all 3 functions. If you want a good sign of tendency toward dictatorship in the United States today, you can't do better than these signing statements where the president imposes his own interpretation on the law, in essence making him the person who passes the law, as well as what it means, the function of the judiciary together. High-ranking whistleblowers. It would appear the only individuals in this administration who are ever punished or demoted or fired are those who speak the truth. I would say that the single easiest yardstick to measure how far one is going to go in the Bush administration is just how big a lie they're willing to tell the American people with a straight face. And some of these are stunningly appalling. I mean, take for example, the Christy Whitman and the Environmental Protection Agency telling first responders in New York that toxic cloud dust was perfectly safe to breathe. It included all these fine particles of concrete. It included all the residues from the explosive thermate that was used to bring the buildings down. It included all the asbestos in the building. It included all the heavy metals and other components of computers, not to mention the desks, the tables, the chairs, and the human beings that were all pulverized, blown into tiny, tiny particles. I've had first responders call me and barely able to gasp a breath to explain how they were suffering from the acute effects of this, and they are dying. They are dying by the thousands. Warrantless wiretapping. This is stunning. The kind of wiretapping that's taking place actually turns out to be no good for identifying terrorists, but excellent for identifying your political opponents and their networks of associates. Here was a nice piece by Floyd Rudman in Counterpunch. Why does the NSA engage in mass surveillance of Americans when it's statistically impossible for such spying to detect terrorists? Stop and think about it. They are doing this on a massive scale, There is a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of the population that has any terrorist orientation. They are smart enough to know that they read the headlines, the newspapers, watch television, that there's a massive surveillance program going on. They've always operated in coded and encrypted messages with few and far between publicly accessible communications. You're not going to catch terrorists by the kind of data mining operation that's taking place here. And when they send General Hayden over to the CIA, what's actually taking place is a consolidation of the single last independent intelligence agency that stood up against this administration. Irony of ironies. For years, I have argued for the abolition of the CIA on the ground that its operations are secret. And if the citizens of the United States don't know what the CIA is doing, and it's an extension of our foreign policy, how can we know if we approve of our own nation's foreign policy? Well, what's going on here now is the Department of Defense has extended its reach over the CIA, which, as I say, ironically, actually has been our last serious bastion of opposition to falsehoods being perpetrated by this administration. Hayden said, he was going to sever his connection to the Pentagon. When that man was sworn in, he was wearing his uniform with all 4 stars. I tell you, what a fraud, what hypocrisy. The CIA shakeup. Well, this is part and parcel. Portugas evidently wasn't working hard enough, fast enough, and as I've already explained, this extends DoD control, consolidates surveillance. Prison camps. This last January, the Army Corps of Engineers gave Halliburton's subsidiary, Kellogg Brown & Root, $400 million to build detention centers in the United States for the purpose of unspecified programs. There are anywhere from 40 to 400, or will be, of these camps. I've often wondered what Donald Rumsfeld was doing with the $2.3 trillion he reported to Congress was missing and the Pentagon could not account for. On guess what day, my friends? 9/10, the day before these events. Now I say, that's an exquisite sense of timing, because you have some news like this and you'd like it all to be obliterated from the consciousness of the American public or even the Congress so you can come back and ask for more. I can't imagine a better arrangement or sequence of events. So we got $2.3 trillion you can't account for. And in addition, we have base closings. I find this very peculiar. How can we, in the middle of this war, be closing bases? One thing you don't know about when you get involved in war is what kind of resources you need, where they need to be located. The last thing, and I say this as a former Marine Corps officer, the last thing I would expect in a time of foreign engagement would be be closing any bases. As far as I can ascertain, my best guess is they were closing those bases because they needed more detention facilities, and those bases were very appropriate to be adapted for that purpose. We also hear, by the way, creepy reports of the importation of guillotines made in China into these detention facilities. Now, I have seen too many reports of this, had a person who was petrified call me up to talk about this. But as Steve Jones has observed, in this case, we need hard evidence, but there's something very, very peculiar going on here. And I hesitate to even mention it, but what's going on in our nation is like cancer. Anyone who has had cancer, as I have had, knows that the claim that what you don't know can't hurt you is as false as could possibly be. What we have and what we're dealing with in this country is a cancer on the body politic. And we have to confront it and excise it if we're going to be restored to a state of health. And 10th and finally, and I'm sure you can recognize every one of these as components of the current state of affairs in domestic politics, is the internet clampdown. I'll tell you, the media consolidation has been so great that basically 5 corporations control 90% of everything you and I ever hear, ever read in the newspaper, ever watch on television. The only true sources remaining for freedom of speech in this country are talk radio and the internet. And we all know that if it weren't for the internet, we would not be here today. Scholars for 9/11 Truth, as an illustration, was a virtual society. I had not met any members of Scholars for 9/11 Truth until